Welcome to this month's ITA Clean Sport Education webinar titled Ask the Expert Nutrition. My name is Mary Irvin and I am a member of the education team at the ITA. Joining me today, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Louise Burke. Louise is the Chair of Sports Nutrition at the Australian Catholic University and a Director of the IOC Diploma programme in Sports Nutrition. Welcome to the webinar. Louise and I are going to have a big chat today answering all of your questions, and I will introduce her a little bit more in just a moment. Now, to get the most out of today's webinar and to share Louise's experience, we are offering translation in Arabic, French, Russian, and Spanish. We're going to be answering some of your questions live at the end of the session, and we will also record the session. Now, I am pleased to offer our thanks to our official presenting partner, Inform Sport, whose support of these webinars allows us to deliver them free of charge to the community in the languages I just mentioned. Now, Inform Sport is a global certification programme for supplements that batch test products for substances prohibited in sport. As supplement contamination continues to be one of the leading causes of inadvertent doping, we encourage athletes and their support personnel to check all products before use at sport.wetestYoutrust.com. Now, many factors contribute to success in sport, and nutrition is a key component. But what is the link to clean sport? Well, the IOC consensus statement on dietary supplements and the high-performance athlete states that nutrition usually makes a small but potentially valuable contribution to successful performance in elite athletes, and dietary supplements can make a minor contribution to this nutrition program. This statement goes on to tell us that supplement use in sport is widespread at all levels of sport. Now, the appropriate use of some supplements can benefit an athlete, but others may harm an athlete's health, performance, and/or livelihood and reputation if an anti-doping rule violation results. And what is a supplement? A supplement can come in many forms, for example, bars, gels, shakes, and powders. And what are the risks? Well, supplements are a risk for athletes because the supplement industry is not well regulated. This means supplements can be contaminated during the manufacturing process or in the supply chain of ingredients. They can be mislabeled with the contents not matching what is labeled. And both contamination and mislabeling can lead to the inadvertent ingestion of prohibited substances and an anti-doping rule violation. So it's important for you to be aware that no supplement is 100% risk-free for an athlete and may result in an anti-doping rule violation. And we're going to discuss more about this next month when our webinar will focus on supplements. Now, this session will focus on food, but naturally there will also be times when we mention supplements such as bars or gels when addressing a specific question. If an athlete does choose to use a supplement after considering all the options and making an informed decision, they should only consider the use of a batch-tested supplement. And batch testing, in the context of anti-doping, means a supplement that has been tested by an independent supplement certification company for substances prohibited in sport. And here on your screen, you can see some of these companies. You can also check with your NADO for their recommendation. So, given we know the risks of supplements for athletes and the impact that an unintentional anti-doping rule violation can have on an athlete, we recommend that athletes do everything they can before using supplements to mitigate the risk. Now, thank you again for all the nutrition questions you have sent us in advance. We received a lot. Now, we have grouped them into subject areas, tried to capture as many as possible together, and Louise is going to take us through them for the rest of this session. So to talk more about this and the big piece at the bottom of this pyramid, we have invited Louise to this webinar today to share her practical advice and tips from her experience on how to make the most out of nutrition. Now, Louise is a sports dietitian with 40 years of experience. She worked at the Australian Institute of Sport for 30 years and was a team dietitian for Australia at 5 Olympic Games. She is a director of the IOC Diploma in Sports Nutrition. She is also the chair of sports nutrition at the Australian Catholic University. Louise, welcome to the webinar and thank you for joining us for such an important topic for athletes.
It's great to be here. I'm so excited to see all the people popping up with their names and countries identified. I can't believe how many people around the world are interested to be up at this time. So thank you very much, Murray, for inviting me and for organising this. And I love the opportunity to make people excited about what nutrition can offer for sports performance.
Thanks so much, Louise. And I should have asked you because you're joining us from Australia. What time is it with you?
It's 10 o'clock at night.
10 o'clock at night. Yeah, you mentioned we do really have a global audience. I jotted down a few countries. So we had Mongolia, Spain, Uruguay, Chile, Malaysia, Luxembourg, and I think that was just the first 6 or 7 who wrote in the chat. True global audience. So it's great to have you with us. Spreading your nutrition expertise to so many of our audience. And let's just launch straight in with the first question that we received in advance. And that is, Louise, what has been your biggest challenge in sports nutrition in your experience?
I think my biggest challenge is making people feel that there's so many different ways in which nutrition can enhance performance, and that we should be thinking more globally, and we should also be thinking about having our own special ways of doing it, and they can be different from everybody else, but they can be perfect for us. So it's recognizing the importance of getting the context and the individual side of things organized.
Thanks, Louise. And I think we'll see a sort of similar theme as we go through some of the other questions as well, which we have grouped. I know we're going to do our best. Some of the questions we got were very general as well. So I know when we're answering the question, there are also a lot of prompts that athletes will have to think about in terms of, what sport they're competing in, if they're in sort of competition mode, training mode, where they are within the season as well. But let's give it a go. So let's take a look at our first topic, and I'm calling this a food first or general approach. We had a lot of similar questions here, as well as some more specific ones that are also listed on the screen now. And we also had a number of questions about taking what some athletes have asked as a safe nutrition approach. Louise, I think the best way of tackling these is to ask you sort of to address all of the questions on screen, maybe in one go, and then we'll go through to the next topic.
Yes, I think a good place to start is to recognise how important the everyday diet, or sometimes we call it the training diet, is. Because sometimes the competition diet gets all the publicity because it's kind of the pizzazz, but we forget that what we do every day is what helps us to get the training done and adapting to that and getting us to the starting line in the best shape possible. And one of the things that's sometimes hard to have people understand is that there's no single way to get that right for everybody. And when people ask me what's the best food or what's the right diet, I say there's many different ways of doing the same thing. And one of the funny stories I think that I heard during the Paralympic Games was an athlete who was successful being interviewed, and he said that he'd been really committed with his preparation, and he'd eaten the same food for every meal for months leading into the competition, including at the Paralympics itself. And he chose it as a burrito. Now, I don't know if he actually had the same ingredients in that burrito, but he felt that he had this magic food and he ate it at every meal because he felt that it was so right. And he may well have been able, with his burrito choice, to get all the things that he needed and assemble it in the right proportions. But my thought would be, there's so many other ways that you could get those same nutrients, if that was what was right for you, from many other different foods. And what's really important for an athlete to do is to find what works for them, not just in terms of how much energy and how much carbs and how much protein, but also, what do I like eating? What does my family eat? What does my culture offer us? And so that you can find lots of different ways of getting your goals from a different range of foods to somebody else. And the other thing it's important to recognize as an athlete is that needs change from day to day because we train differently. Athletes understand that they periodize their training. They do different kinds of sessions from one day to the next, and different phases of the year have different emphasis. And so nutrition needs to track the way that training changes. And so it's not a matter of finding that lucky burrito. It's a matter of understanding what your goals are and then finding the food that's right for your environment and for your budget and for your taste buds and any medical needs or whatever the things that you need to tick off on your list, and being able to assemble what your nutritional goals are from a whole range of foods. And one of the things that we can then think about is when you're narrowing down to a different sport, and we've got a question here on trap shooting. I don't know a lot about trap shooting, and if a trap shooting athlete came to see me, I'd sit down and I'd ask them, tell me about your training. How many hours do you do? What sort of environment do you do it in? Do you have to do any resistance work, any strength work in the gym? Do you need to do some running to keep fit? And how often do you compete? When you do compete, how long does the session last for? What are the kind of things that make you feel tired? When I ask those kind of questions, I start to then think about, well, how many calories do I need to eat for the training that I'm doing? Do I need, if I'm doing several sessions in the day, to think about recovering between sessions, refueling? If I'm doing my shooting outside and it's hot and I'm sweating, do I need to think about drinking during the session and between sessions? And so I'm not giving you all the answers for trap shooting, but I'm telling you the way that I would approach it, the questions I'd ask to give me a sort of a feel for what are the fuel needs. I might need to think about what's your body composition? What do you need to have in terms of physique that helps you to be a good trap shooter? Is it being light? Is it being strong? Is it being tall? And so if I ask enough questions, then I'll be able to get to the bottom of what are the nutritional needs. And then I might say to you, well, where do you live? What do you like eating? What's your budget like? Do you have any conditions where you've got allergies or intolerances of foods that we need to avoid? Are there special things in your culture or your religion that say that you need to eat differently? And so once I have all that information, I can put that plan together. And it's not just for trap shooting, it's for that specific individual trap shooter to take into account the special needs that they might have. The question that we were asked, what's good for energy? Well, that's an interesting question because from a dietitian's point of view, energy means calories or kilojoules, and it's the amount of those calories or kilojoules in a food that can be part of you maintaining the fuel that you need or the physique that you need. But when sometimes people are thinking about energy, they're thinking more specifically about the fuel the muscle needs. And in many cases, that's carbohydrate as one of the types of nutrients that does give us calories, but it's a specific sort of calorie that the muscle uses in a different way from some of the other calorie providing fuels. And sometimes when people think about energy, they're thinking about sort of get up and go. And so they might be thinking about something like caffeine, which doesn't actually give you any calories, but it makes your brain feel differently so that it masks fatigue, and that sometimes can make you feel energetic. So I've just looked at 3 different ways of thinking about energy, and I can find different foods or different ways of addressing that. But generally what we'd say to athletes is getting the energy equation right is understanding how many calories you need a day for your body weight and for the amount of training that you're doing, maybe changing it if you're needing to gain weight or lose weight, and then thinking specifically about how you eat, the amount of carbohydrate in the day that meets the fuel needs of your training sessions, and spreading that energy over the day so that you're having it when you're doing exercise. Some athletes are so busy during the day, they don't eat the fuel that they need for the training that they're doing, and they eat it all at night when it's not going to be as useful. So it's about the amount, but also the timing and the type of energy. Have we met all the questions in that little list, do you think?
Yeah, I think so, Louise. Yeah. Yeah, and I think as well, I like the approach in terms of it's not just, I mentioned it's a sport or a time of year, but we're drilling down right to the individual. And it's difficult to do this in 60 minutes in a webinar as well, but I really like the way that you're giving questions that the athletes can think about, particularly maybe if they didn't have a one-on-one with a dietitian, but already some things that the athletes could do themselves to think about getting the best fuel for their performance. So we're going to get a little bit more detailed again now when we look at the next slide. And this one, we had quite a number of questions about specific foods or food types as well. Lots about protein, for example. And also we had an interesting one, I thought as well, was a question about whether there were any prohibited foods and also whether there were any prohibited foods for a particular sport. So if you're happy to address these ones as well, please, Louise.
So protein is one of the nutrients that's had quite a bit of publicity over the last number of years in sports nutrition, because most countries have guidelines for how much protein people need to eat each day for health. But we now know that athletes who do heavy training or regular training of every day, and often more than one session a day, need to have more protein. And that's not just for resistance training athletes with the muscles where we can sort of see where the protein is being used to help their sports performance, but endurance athletes also need extra protein because a lot of the tissues that they're using, the muscle that's doing the work for endurance sport, breaks down and it needs to be replaced and repaired. And so it doesn't matter whether you're a bodybuilder or a marathon runner, you do need to eat more protein than the recommended dietary intakes that most countries give. And luckily, because athletes are doing exercise that requires extra energy to meet their fuel needs, most athletes can eat enough protein just because they're eating more food. What we try and help athletes do these days now is think about the timing of when they eat the protein, because we now know that it's best to be able to spread it over the day. In some countries, and in my country, most people don't spread their protein very well. They don't have a lot of protein for breakfast. They don't have a lot of protein for lunch, but then they have a really large evening meal and have most of their protein there. And so when we're working with athletes, we need to help them sometimes to think of foods that they can have for breakfast and for lunch to increase the protein content. And sometimes it's things like having yogurt and dairy with their breakfast, or putting eggs or a protein food on toast, or having a cooked meal. At lunchtime, it could be having lovely sandwiches or salad bowls that have got some good protein added, whether it's cheese or eggs or meat or a vegetarian source like legumes and nuts, etc. We also think about the time after exercise as being an important time to get protein to the muscle, because sometimes that's once we've done the exercise, we've stimulated the muscle, or we've created some damage in the muscle. And so that's a good time to have the building blocks to start the repair or the recovery process. And sometimes that's when athletes don't have access to be able to cook or prepare foods. And so that's sometimes where, things that can go on the go with you, and whether that's like a Tetra pack of chocolate milk, or whether it's a yogurt, or whether it's some boiled eggs that you've brought with you and kept in a plastic bag. But that's sometimes where the sports foods come in handy for athletes, where a protein powder that's been batch tested might be something that you don't need to have a refrigerator, or something that you can prepare foods. If you're trying to get that post-training protein snack consumed and you haven't got the ability to have everyday food with you, that can be a time where a protein bar or a protein shake can be a useful way to use sports foods. Often eggs get a bad rap when it comes to thinking about protein foods, and that goes back probably to 20 years ago, maybe even more, when we worried about how much cholesterol people were eating in terms of the health aspects of cholesterol in their blood levels. And unfortunately, eggs do have cholesterol in them, and they were blamed a lot for causing high cholesterol in people's blood, when in fact that's not really something that we now believe is true. So eggs are a really good source of protein, and they're a great food to be able to top up a meal. As I said before, if you're normally a toast eater for breakfast, or you have a sandwich for lunch, and you're thinking of what can I have on my toast or in my sandwich that's a good protein source and really easy to cook, eggs are a good answer. And so there's no number of eggs that you're supposed to eat a week. You don't have to eat eggs at all, but it's good news now to be able to say to people, eggs used to be the bad guys, but now there's lots of ways in which we can think of them as being a really useful contributor to a well-balanced meal. When we think about the prohibited foods, there's not really a protein that's prohibited per se, but sometimes we find both in sports foods or in everyday foods that there can be contaminants, particularly from some of the anabolic agents that are used sometimes in some countries for animal farming. So in some countries, people make their cows and their pigs big and strong and get them to market earlier by using some anabolic steroids. And those countries need to be very wary of, particularly when they have athletes that are doing competition in their countries, to let athletes know that this is a problem with the food supply. There are some countries in the world that are well known for this, and we say to athletes who go to competition in those countries to either make sure that the competition venue and the competition organisers have organised a safe supply of the protein foods, or to take your own protein foods with you. Some of our athletes will take cans of tuna or other forms of protein with them when they travel, just so they can avoid having some of the food that could be contaminated. And some of the protein supplements can also be contaminated with some prohibited substances, as you said, because of the regulation, the poor regulation of some supplement manufacturing. So that's why the batch testing is very important. And it's also why when some of the countries that do use anabolic steroids in animal farming have competitions for sport, that they need to do good marketing and publicity about how to be safe in choosing the good food forms in their country. Have we covered all the answers there, do we think?
Yeah, thank you, Louise. And we're going to go into a poll question next. But while we transition to that as well, just in reference to what you mentioned there about the contamination of meat in some countries, we will pop a link in the chat for everyone to see. The World Anti-Doping Agency has published some guidance on that. So we'll pop that in the chat so everyone can take a look at that. Now, the poll question that I do want to ask everyone, and we have a big audience today, is where do you get your nutrition information from? Now, this is a multiple choice poll, and your answers are anonymous. Please do choose as many options as you like. Do you get your nutrition information from a dietitian or nutritionist, the internet? Do you get it from your national anti-doping organization? Do you get it from a medical team? Do you get it from the club maybe? Or if it's other, feel free to choose that. And you can also expand on that answer there in the chat if you wish so as well. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment as the answers come in. And when we do close the poll, I will ask Louise just to comment on the answers, see if there are any surprises there or not. We can see, though, on my end, that over 50% of people are getting advice from dietitians or nutritionists. In second place there, around 50% of you are also getting information from the internet. And maybe I'll particularly ask you to comment on that one, Louise, because that's very wide as well. Just like some of our nutrition questions are very wide. Getting information from the internet. I'm sure there are some resources in particular that we can point people towards. Now, we've had nearly 2/3 of people taking part in this poll, which was fantastic. And indeed, nutritionists or dietitians, followed by the internet, is the most popular choice. Louise, any brief comments on that for us?
Well, it's great to see so many people having access to a dietitian or a nutritionist and being able to use them. I love to see that, because really that is a lot of other people who've got medical and science training, like doctors and exercise scientists, but really the dietitian nutritionist is the expert in turning ideas about nutrients into real food. And if you want to get that absolute individualized program, that's the best person to see, because they'll have the knowledge about the principles of what you're doing, but they'll also be able to translate it into meals, and they might even be able to teach you how to cook them. So there's lots of good reasons for seeing a dietitian. When it comes to the internet, as you said, the information that comes there is so varied, but there are some great places to get very reputable information. And I know in Australia that Sports Dietitians Australia and the Australian Institute of Sport spend a lot of time putting resources together. In other countries, there'll be a professional sports dietitians body, or there'll be an Olympic committee or some medical body that runs the sport in your country. And that sometimes is the whole country, but it could be from an individual sport, and they'll invest in having some good resources as well. So I'd go for those organised sources as the best form, and you'll probably be able to differentiate between those sources and other people. If someone's trying to sell you something, I think that's always a good clue that it's there's something that's biased behind it. So try and get your information from organisations who do this as a service, and that's their main reason for being there. Can I also just say there's a question that's popped up in relation to the last slide we had about India being a predominantly vegetarian country. And that's a very good reminder to me that when I was talking about protein before, I was thinking about animal sources, because I'm from Australia, where most people eat animal foods. But of course, people can choose to be vegetarians or vegans for very good reasons. And it's entirely possible to have a great diet and get all the needs that you have for sports performance from a vegetarian or vegan diet. And it's easier to do that when you live in a community where other people are doing it too. And so everybody has learned about the best sources of food to choose. Sometimes in my country, when someone decides to be a vegetarian, they think that means just taking the food, the plate that had meat on it, and taking the meat off and just eating what's left, without thinking, what do I need to replace it with to get some protein and some minerals and some of the other important things that meat would normally provide. And so it's great when you in a community where you can learn from other people. But otherwise, there are plenty of good resources and plenty of good books that you can learn to cook in a vegetarian or a vegan way. And the important thing is that you're able to choose new food sources, particularly things like nuts and legumes and soy and seeds, so that you're replacing the things like protein and iron and zinc that came from the animal foods that I'm used to eating. So I think the concern is sometimes that people won't eat enough food because sometimes they don't know how to do the cooking, or sometimes if you're living in a community where not many people are vegetarian, then you may be able to cook at home, but when you're out and about and you're looking for that post-training snack, or you're really busy and you're running from class to class, it's sometimes more difficult for you to be able to go into a shop and to buy some of the food sources that are vegetarian to replace what other people would be eating. So it sometimes takes a bit more effort, a bit more planning, so that you know where you can get things, or you can take things with you so that you get plenty of opportunities to eat your energy requirements over the day.
Lovely. Thank you, Louise. Now, you mentioned as well the Australian Institute of Sports, and actually our next slide does have some of their resources on there as well. And at the end of the webinar as well, we also have some other resources that we'll share with you, and everybody is going to receive the slides after the webinar ends as well, so that they can do sort of additional research as needed. And the reason I wanted to show the Australian Institute of Sport resources here was in relation to a question we had about natural options to supplements. Now, this guide here is a nutrition and supplements guide. But what I particularly like about this Australian one is that there are lots of athlete fact sheets, 1 or 2 pages. They are in the supplements section, but it also shows you what the equivalent foods composition for a particular supplements would be. So for example, the image that is on screen here shows the equivalent food composition for electrolyte replacement, focusing on salty foods. But there are many, many more examples, I think more than 20 on this particular site. Louise, would you like to reference this, particularly in relation to the question that we got?
Yes, and look, there's no doubt that sometimes we need to find a food form that's practical to consume, particularly during and after exercise. Sometimes it's about being able to manage to prepare and carry the food with you. Sometimes it's about having something that's just easy to consume. And so sometimes it might be carbohydrate you're replacing, sometimes it might be protein, it could be fluids, it could be electrolytes. And there are some great sports foods that package those nutrients in a really practical way. So sports drinks and protein shakes and sports bars all can play a really useful role in sports nutrition by providing that really practical way of getting just the nutrients that you need. But sports foods are expensive, and some of them carry that risk of being contaminated. So I always like to say, is there a time that there's a more convenient food form? And as an example, we know that, say, something like pasta is a good source of carbohydrate. And when you're doing a long endurance event, say a cycling race or a marathon, we now give athletes guidelines about consuming carbohydrate during that event. And technically, pasta could be a way of consuming carbohydrate, but my bike handling skills are so terrible. If I tried to eat a bowl of pasta on the bike, I would fall off the bike. And it's not something that's easy to grab if you're going past the aid station in a marathon. So it makes sense to have something that's easy to grab. And that's why bars and gels are so useful. But a banana is a sort of a natural sports bar, if you like. And you can use honey or jam as a natural form of having a gel. And so if you're in that situation where you can't afford every time to have the more expensive option, and also you like the idea of being able to use everyday foods, then I think these fact sheets are a really good way of saying, yes, bars and gels and shakes can be really useful, but maybe there is a food form that you could use most of the time and save the sports foods for the time that it's the only thing that can do the job. And there are times when that happens. We were talking the other day about, I was doing some work recently with an open water swimmer, and she really did need to use gels when she was swimming in the ocean, because it's really impractical for her to peel a banana, and the salt water in her mouth makes the banana taste really terrible. But having the gel where she can just squeeze it into her mouth and she doesn't have to have it interact with the salt water made that sports gel so much more helpful for her than the everyday food. So there's ways in which you can look at the pros and cons of the sports food versus the everyday food. And, you know, sometimes there's a role for one and sometimes there's a role for the other.
Thanks, Louise. Now, our next couple of slides are big ones as well. As you can imagine, we received a lot of questions around nutrition around competition and also nutrition around training. So let's tackle those next. And first up, the competition ones there, and then at the bottom of the slide, the training ones.
Yes, so when you ask a dietitian about what do I need to eat for competition, we go through a list of questions that try to get to the bottom of what is the physiological basis of competition and why would I start feeling fatigued? Now, in some sports, it's such a short event. If you're running 100 meters, there's not really a nutritional strategy that's going to make that any better on the day of the competition, because everything that you've done in training puts you in the best position to do 10 seconds of exercise as quickly as you can. But if you're doing a much longer event, then it gets to the point where you can run out of fuel or you can sweat and become dehydrated, or a number of other different sort of things that might limit performance, where we can say, hey, we can do things before the event, during the event, or between events if you've got multiple games or heats or races in the same competition, to try and help nutrition address that fatigue factor. And so we sit down and we think about, what does this competition look like? What is it that you're going to run out of, or what's going to become limiting when it comes to nutrition? And what are the opportunities in your event to do something about it? And then we try and match up the plan with the opportunities. So I'll give you an example. Sometimes of just thinking how something can sound the same, but it has very different opportunities. So at the Paris Olympic Games this time, there were 2 marathons on the program. There was the running marathon and there was a race walking marathon. And you might say to yourself, well, they're both the same, so everybody would just do the same thing. But having worked with both groups of athletes, I can tell you that the marathon running race is really different, because it's run on a course that goes from one place to 26 miles down the road to the finish line. And there's an aid station or a feed zone every 5 Ks. And the athletes are running really fast and they're going past those aid stations and they're grabbing drink and some carbohydrate and trying to have as quickly as they can enough to give them some fuel, give them some hydration and keep moving. Race walking is different though, because it's on a looped course. It has to have judges looking at the technique of the race walkers. And so there's an aid station every 1 or 2 Ks, and the athletes are going around the same aid station. And I've worked on the aid station at some Olympic Games, and it's great in terms of planning nutrition, because you've got an opportunity to have the nutrition more frequently, and you can have somebody who's in charge of it, knowing what you've had and keeping track of it. When you're doing the marathon, all those aid stations sort of just go past in a blur, and it's very difficult for you to know how much you've had over the course of the race, unless you're very clever. But in the race walking, there's an opportunity for somebody to be able to see what happens every 4 minutes and to keep helping you to keep track of how much fuel you're having, how much fluid you're having, how comfortable does it feel. And you've got more opportunity to have smaller amounts and sort of spread it out to get what you need than in the marathon race. So that's just an example of 2 races that might have the same requirements, but completely different opportunities to do something about it. And so I look at all of the different competitions in the Olympics or any sporting event and say, what does it look like in terms of the physiology, and where are those things that cause fatigue that I can address with nutrition? And even in some shorter events like swimming or rowing, etc., you don't run out of fuel in a single race. But if you're in a program where you're doing more than one race on the same afternoon or the same day, you might need to think about what you do between races and what you do overnight to the next race as your big nutrition opportunity. So it's not what happens during, it's what happens between that becomes your goal. We've got climbing as a competition that's been picked out for a question. And that was one of the events that I just loved on the Paris program. I hadn't had a lot of experience working with climbers before, and it was lovely to see this event brought to us, and you could sit and watch it on television and learn a lot about it. And what I could see from my viewing seat was that the climbers needed to stay light, because obviously you don't want to be, carrying wall when you're going up a vertical climb, but you also need to be able to eat between events to keep your fuel levels up and hydration levels up, because it was very hot in Paris and the event required the climber to do more than one heat or one climb in a session. And so we noticed the climbers between their climbs, making sure they had access to fluid, not overloading so they felt uncomfortable or gaining extra weight that they didn't need to carry up the climb, but having enough to keep themselves adequately hydrated. And I'm sure that what they ate in the days leading up to it had a good carbohydrate source, but they probably didn't eat a lot of fiber or a lot of sort of extra weight of food, so that when they got to the day of competition, they were as light as possible and didn't have a lot of food in their gastrointestinal tract. And that's something that quite a few sports do these days, having a low fiber diet in the days leading up to competition so they can get the carbohydrate, but they're not carrying all that extra roughage in their gut that adds weight, but also can cause gastrointestinal problems if you're doing the kind of sport that is very intense and makes you sort of joggle around. Have we answered? There's got the open water swimming question. Yes, so the fueling for that, obviously having carbohydrate-rich meals in the day leading into the event and the morning of the event before the swim, but then having your feed boat or your, depending whether you're doing in a competition in a race where there's lots of other athletes, or whether you're doing it as a single swim like the English Channel, etc., where you may have just a boat that's going with you, you need to have people there who've got carbohydrate-rich sources that they can put on a little stick and hand out to you. So that's where the practicality of what can you do for those things. I've seen athletes quite successfully take gels off a stick. They can just grab something. Sometimes a cup or a bottle is handed out. And my experience with the open water swimming is that it needs to have a taste that's compatible with sea water, if you're doing ocean swimming rather than river swimming. And that's something that you need to learn what to do and to keep doing it for a period of time to see how it changes over the course of the race. A lot of athletes that I work with who do lengthy races say that they get sick of the same flavour and they like having something different at each of the aid stations, even if it's just a different flavour of the same thing, so they've got something to look forward to and they don't get that flavour fatigue. Altitude. I'm not sure we mean very high altitude like mountains, which is a different sort of sport again, or whether we're talking about athletes going to altitude training where it's high enough to cause physiological stress so that we adapt to that by producing new red blood cells and improving our iron carrying ability to get more oxygen to our muscles and help performance that way. or whether we're talking about, people who go to very, very high altitudes and need to be able to carry their own food with them and have things that they can cook and prepare with minimal infrastructure, so that they can keep fueling themselves as they get to the top of the mountain. Certainly one of the things we think about at altitude is iron, because if you're trying to use altitude training to improve your red blood cell level, you need both the iron to be able to build those new red blood cells, but you also need good protein intake. So one of the things that we check with athletes before they go to altitude is that their iron status is good. Sometimes they need to take iron supplements before and during the period of time they're at altitude. But we also often make sure that they have plenty of protein at their altitude training. And sometimes a good time to have it is just before you go to bed. That's the time that an extra serve of protein in the day can be helpful to help with that overnight recovery, with all this extra training and this extra stress that you're putting your body through to try and help it adapt to become better at oxygen carrying capacity.
Thank you, Louise. Now, I think we have 3 more slides before we try and tackle a couple of the live Q&A that has come through as well. So let's see how we go. I just want to mention that we've had one comment in the chat saying, it's a real luxury having you speak, and always a pleasure. And I would just like to echo that as well. It means there is so much to get through. It's really hard to get through everybody's questions in the time allocation that we have, but I'm sure this is a topic that we will come back to again and again. So the next slide that we have here, I've grouped into what I've called lifestyle. I think one of the questions, particularly the first one, we have perhaps already tackled through one of the earlier questions. But interesting one there about aging athletes as well, and also someone who is practicing Ramadan.
Yes, so the aging one is a very good question. It's one I'm thinking about all the time, because I'm an aging athlete. I run marathons, and I've certainly had to think differently about the way that I eat at my age now from, when I was 20 doing the same thing. So one of the things about aging is that our ability to use some of our nutrients and to be able to be turning over our body parts and recovering is less good than when we're young. And so sometimes we need to help aging athletes have more and better protein sources and spread those over the day. Sometimes when you're young, just eating a large amount of food means that you kind of stumble into what you need in the whole range of what happens over the day. But with the aging athletes, we try and be much more strategic. So I'm much more wary these days, or much more vigilant in making sure that I do have a good protein-rich breakfast and lunch, and I'm thought about what I'm going to have after training, so that the protein I eat, I'm trying to make sure I get the maximum value out of, knowing that I'm not as good at being able to digest and make use of it in terms of recovery. Other things that happen when you're aging is that sometimes your general activity levels go down, so that even though you're still doing sport, you're not doing the same amount of other exercise in the day. And so eating the same amount as you used to sometimes isn't suitable anymore. And so you have to be a bit more careful with just reducing calorie intake a little bit, which means that you have to then be more careful to eat the good foods first. Sometimes when you're young and you're burning so many calories, you think, oh, it doesn't really matter. I can have a lot of treat foods and junk foods because I'm eating plenty of food and I'm getting enough of what I need. But as you get older and you need to eat less food, then you need to be more aware of getting what you really need first and making the treat foods much more of an occasional thing. Ramadan is a really interesting challenge for a dietitian to work with. And if people haven't worked with this before, for 1 month of the year in the Muslim calendar, Muslims respect Ramadan by fasting during the hours of light. And so from sunrise to sunset, no food or drink is consumed. And that's a very special part of the faith. And it's all done in making people be aware of how lucky we are, and to think about the world and what we're giving to the world. So it has a very important place in the culture of that religion. But in terms of meeting sports nutrition guidelines, it can be tricky if you're still trying to do your sport during the day. Now, I haven't lived this myself, but some of my friends who have worked in countries that are mostly Muslim say that during Ramadan, often what happens is the whole country flips its time zones. And so people do most of their things during the night now. And so you can continue to do your sport and you can continue to do your socializing, but everything happens at night rather than during the day. And so it can work. If you're trying to practice Ramadan in a country where nobody else is doing it, it becomes difficult because you're in the opposite of what everybody else is doing and what needs to do it. So it is definitely a challenge, and some of the athletes do it really well by trying to change their training times so that they will train just when the night falls, so that they're able to have some food and some drink just before they do their session, and they'll do a training session just before it becomes light again, so that again they can recover from that and then spend the rest of the day with their fasting. So it is challenging, and one of the things that is challenging about it is it changes over the years, because Ramadan isn't a fixed time. It moves with the calendar, and it's about the country that you're living in. So if you're in a country where it gets light at 9 o'clock in the morning and it's dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, sometimes it's like that in London, then you don't have you have a much shorter fasting time than somebody who's living at the other parts of the world where it might get light at 4 o'clock in the morning and it's still light at 9 o'clock at night. That would be very difficult. So it takes some practice and it takes commitment, and I value the effort that athletes who practice Ramadan fasting do, and I really admire their ability to be able to do it and to be able to observe the really important parts of their religion and culture.
Thank you. Let's try one more slide, I think. This one we have called recovery. Several questions that we received around this as well. And the first one was a statement that we received rather than a question. So I think we interpret this one the best we can, Louise. But in our last sort of 5 minutes together, maybe you could whiz through these ones for us.
Yeah, so recovery is all about thinking about, what have I done during that session? I've burnt some fuel, which I need to replace before my next session if I'm going to be able to do that well. And I've probably sweated and I need to replace the fluid and the electrolytes that have gone. And I also need to recover, as I said, with the protein. And so the amount that you need to eat to recover really depends on what did you do? How important was that session in terms of creating all those needs? And then how much time have you got till the next session to recover? And if you're playing at Wimbledon and you've got a match now and in 3 hours' time you've got your next match, well, then obviously you have to be really proactive in trying to get as much of that recovery happening between those two matches, knowing that it could be the next match you're doing could be 5 hours. So that's a really tough recovery thing. But if you're playing squash once a week, then you don't really need to do anything that's too crazy, because you've got plenty of time to recover and your normal meals will probably, do the job for you. So people have to think specifically about their recovery needs. And even an athlete that trains very hard doesn't need to be super active about it for every session. There are some sessions which are the key sessions of the week that you need to recover after, or you need to prepare for. And there are some sessions that are just really light, and they're not things that you need to go and, do extra special things. So it's understanding what's important based on what the needs and the goals are. Some of the things that we've got here about muscle tears. There is a lot of interest now in whether protein and certain types of protein like collagen can help to prevent muscle tears. There's no really good information that says it's preventive, but certainly if you have injured yourself, then being very careful with having good amounts of protein and not getting super worried about weight control is important. It used to be that when athletes became injured and they thought, oh, I can't train now, I better stop eating because I don't want to get out of shape. And we now know that part of recovery and part of rehabilitation of injuries is gaining new protein. And so you don't want to starve yourself during those periods just because, you know, you're worried about staying in shape. It's important that you continue to eat and eat well so that you can do all the things that your body needs to do to get better. And the final question about the sport climber, well, relative energy deficiency is not understanding what the fuel and energy requirements of your sport are and eating enough food to replace that. And that's a really good time to go to see a dietitian because they can sit down and work out quantitatively how much energy you do need to consume in a day and find those occasions to be able to eat enough. And sometimes it's not knowing what to eat, but sometimes it's having enough time in the day and the availability of food. And that's where the dietitian can use all the practical skills to be able to marry up what you want to do with the food availability and your ability to consume it. I
Thanks,
think the only thing I've
Louise.
missed here is the magnesium and the electrolytes and the cramps. And that's another tricky one. There's a lot of people that believe that cramps are due to a loss of electrolytes, but in most cases, cramps are due to being fatigued, doing more exercise than you're currently trained to do. And so mostly cramps take care of themselves as you do more training and prepare yourself to be able to cope with the load that you're doing. And it's only those athletes that do extreme exercise and do sweat quite a lot that need to worry about the electrolyte replacement, but they should be doing that for lots of other reasons, not just for the cramps.
Lovely. Thank you so much. As I mentioned, we did get lots and lots of questions. We've tried to group them together as best we can. Maybe we just take one from the Q&A box before we wrap up. I think the first one from Mario, we have tackled that came into the box before you discussed that. And I'm also going to talk about the supplements webinar that we will host next month as well. Maybe we can just quickly touch on Henry's one then, Louise. In Sierra Leone, athletes consume a lot of carbon dioxide food. Is it good for an athlete? And here, do they mean that this is preserved food?
I think is it carbohydrate foods? Is that what we're talking about? That athletes in Sierra Leone have a high amount of carbohydrate-rich foods as their natural food sources. And is it good? Yes. Well, it's about what is the exercise that you're doing. And if you're doing exercise that's endurance in nature, and that could be team sport, or it could be running or cycling or swimming, where you're doing long sessions of moderate and high intensity exercise, then that's the fuel that your muscle is using mostly. And so having the amount of carbohydrate to replace it from your diet between sessions is the best way of fueling up. If you're an athlete that does sessions of exercise that are more about tactics or more about resting and then doing a high level sprint, then you're not using as much carbohydrate in your muscles for your sport. And then the amount of carbohydrate that you eat in your diet needs to be less. So it's really about horses for courses, understanding what kind of exercise that you do, what sort of fuel needs it's got. And it's unfortunate at the moment that a lot of people think badly about carbohydrate-rich foods, and yet a lot of them are really very good values of total nutrition quality. It's not just lollies and soft drinks or sodas, drinks that provide carbohydrate, but fruits and starchy vegetables and breads and cereals, whole grains, they're the kinds of carbohydrate-rich foods that we try and have athletes eating most of their calories and fuel from. and then using the sweeter foods, the ones with less nutritional value, just for an occasional treat or for that top up around sport.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you to Henry for the question. Hope that was what you meant. If it wasn't, please do drop us a line, and that goes for all the questions that we weren't able to tackle today. I think once again, we've seen both the importance and the popularity of this topic, and it is definitely something that we will come back to again in the future. But as I promised at the beginning, I am going to leave you with some resources from various NADOs out there, also from the IOC Sports Diploma course as well. Lots of great 1-minute video answers by experts to some of those frequently asked questions as well. As mentioned, too, please do join us for our supplements webinar next month as well. And from me, that really leaves me just the opportunity to wrap up. Say once again, what a pleasure and a massive thank you to have Professor Burke join us today. We hope everyone benefited from this webinar. We will send you the slides after the webinar ends. And if you do have a couple of minutes to fill in a survey, please do let us know what you thought of the webinar. And if you want to stay tuned to all our webinars, you can subscribe using the QR code there as well. Louise, thank you again for your time. It's been absolutely fantastic. And to our audience and participants as well. I hope everyone enjoyed the session and have a great rest of the week. Bye-bye from me.
Thanks so much.